Hello to all of our listeners and welcome to BEaTS Research Radio, a podcast streamed from an active lab at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. My name is Hallie Arnott and I am the Canadian Biomaterials Society Ottawa Student Chapter President and a graduate student in biomedical engineering at the University of Ottawa, and I'll be your host on today's episode. Our goal here at BEaTS Research Radio is to communicate scientific research to the community. We hope that by doing this, we're able to engage our listeners from all backgrounds about how research advancements go from the lab to the clinic or the market, and in some cases, into government policy. And today we'll be speaking a little bit about science and policy in Canada. Before we get going with our interview, I'd like to thank the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, eLife, the Canadian Biomaterials Society Ottawa Student Chapter, and the Department of BMI at the University of Ottawa with the Faculty of Medicine, and finally the BEaTS Research Lab, who are supporting us here at BEaTS Research Radio. Don't forget to subscribe to YouTube, and you can find our podcasts on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. With us today is Dr. Mona Nemer. She is the Chief Science Advisor to Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Minister of Science, and the Cabinet. Her mandate is to provide advice related to science and government policies that support it. This would include advising on ways to ensure that science is considered in policy decisions and ensuring that government science is made fully available to the public. Before becoming the Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Nemer was a professor and the Vice President of Research at the University of Ottawa and the Director of the Molecular Genetics and Cardiac Regeneration Laboratory. Her research focused on the heart and particularly on mechanisms of the heart failure and also congenital heart diseases. With her research in this field, she became a leader in the area of molecular cardiology, and she discovered several genes essential for normal heart development and also its function. She has over 200 highly cited scientific articles and has trained over 100 students from around the world. And today she is here to talk to us about her road from gene discovery to now science policy. So thank you very much for joining us here on BEaTS Research Radio.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this too generous introduction.
Would you be able to tell us a little bit about your role as Chief Science Advisor to Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Minister of Science and Cabinet?
Well, as you summarize it, my role is to provide scientific advice and ensure that science and evidence is considered when government make decisions. So this, in a way, makes me a broker of science, if you want, for the government. Part of my role is also to anticipate challenges and issues that the country or the government will be facing, and look into the science behind it. So, for example, I got involved into the science of microplastic pollution and impact on the environment and health. Looked into other areas of open science, for example, which will be coming out shortly to ensure that science is available actually to the public, and in a number of other areas like that. Part of my role is also to talk about science and raise the awareness and the understanding of science amongst the public, because as you know, science is just so important in all the decisions that we make every day.
Right. So your job really involves looking at lots of different fields, but you transitioned from an academic and research-focused setting at the University of Ottawa, particularly looking at molecular mechanisms with the heart. Can you tell us about kind of your transition from that role at the University of Ottawa and now to more of an advisory position with the Government of Canada?
Well, the transition was fascinating. I took the job because I'm convinced of the importance of science for Canada. So, as I like to say, simply put, I love Canada and I love science. So I took this role because I think that science has a very important role to play at the highest levels of government, and I just want to give back and ensure that there is a better dialogue between scientists and decision makers in Canada.
Right. So do you think, what's the dialogue like right now in terms of how the communication happens between science and government, or researchers and government?
Well, there is dialogue between researchers and government. I think that right now there isn't a lot of dialogue between those researchers that are scientists and engineers and
Right.
government necessarily, and there is some misunderstanding of the realities, on each side.
Right.
A lot of politicians, just like the general public, are actually um, wary or intimidated by
Hmm.
science and scientists, and it's of our own doing because we use these very opaque language and abbreviation that just like
Right.
don't come across properly. So my objective is to make sure that there is better understanding on both sides, that science has so much to contribute, but scientists need to understand how government works, how decisions are made,
Hmm.
and the politicians and also the senior civil servants need to understand how scientists can actually contribute to the challenges that they have and that they need to tackle.
Right. So I guess it's more looking at the necessary or the importance of having interdisciplinary collaborations within research, but also being able to effectively communicate that with the community and then also members of parliament. So so it's very important to make this science accessible to the public as well. In your opinion, what do you think the main challenges and limitations are in doing that?
Well, there are unfortunately a number of them
Right.
that need to be tackled in a systematic way. I think that language barrier is very important, and I'm not talking here about French, English, or other languages,
Right.
but about the language of science itself, and how we need to be better. I guess sensitive to the fact that we're speaking to people who don't know the language, so to perhaps express our ideas in plainer language. I
Hmm.
think that there is a question also of preparing the public to understand science, in the sense that I think we need to increase science literacy
Hmm.
in the country in general, and that starts from very early on, from schools, and but also at the level of adults. We have a lot of catching up to do. Of course, that doesn't happen by lecturing people. So you
Right.
have to engage in a dialogue. You need to be sensitive to what people can understand or can perceive. And I think that one of the important things is to communicate the scientific method. The scientific method is actually very important. It's more important than the conclusions
Right.
in ways, because once you equip the public to understand the scientific method and rigor and the notions of controls and statistic significance and so on, I think that they will be able then to apply it to different areas. So they'll be able to sort out fake news or fake outlets from serious scientific outlets. They'll be able to make their own conclusions in a way as to whether the uncertainty warrants certain steps, or whether
Right.
we have enough to make a decision for now.
Right. And what do you think has been a positive driver in terms of communicating science to the community? Is there something that stands out as being something that's really helped?
I think it's a lot of awareness
Right.
on the on the side of the scientists, that they need to be part of the dialogue. That if we leave a gap in terms of the communication of science to the public, then we're going to be all the time, chasing to correct
Yes.
things and so on. And I think that the new generation actually of scientists are extremely sensitive to communication, to the power and to the need of communication. So I think it's there is like a cultural change that is also happening. But I think that it's not only the young ones; it's everybody that's
Right.
being more aware, because we've seen things like the anti-vaccine movement. We've seen a lot of science denier, and I mean, when you need to go in the street to basically speak for science in the 21st century, then this is when you realize that we have a problem.
Right, that's exactly it. And I think social media has also become a really good driver for science in some cases, and kind of pushing out some very interesting scientific pictures and images. So I think that's also something that's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the idea is to have science where the public is, not necessarily
Yes.
bring it to places like universities, and academic hospitals where they already have some apprehension and where they're intimidated, by the milieu,
Right.
because they don't feel necessarily they belong.
Yes, definitely. So how can you ensure that science is considered when making Canadian policy? How does that occur? How does that happen?
Well, first, I want to, dispel any misconception that there is no science that's weighing in the decision.
Right.
I think that government actually gets a lot of advice. The problem is not the lack of it; it's too much of it.
Too much, right?
And in areas where you have first to have many fields and many scientific areas weigh in an advice, I think this is where things become complex, and of course there are also interpretations to scientific findings, and at times there isn't an agreement necessarily even among the scientists themselves.
Right.
So this is where I guess my work and the work of science advisors becomes important, because it's sort of weeding out the good science from the bad science and synthesizing it to make it digestible and actionable, if you want, for the government.
Okay.
There are already scientists in government departments that are involved in the policy development. We're trying to strengthen this by having science advisors actually in the various ministries,
Okay.
so that these also advisors constitute a network that can now be brought together to make sure that we have an interdisciplinary discussion and conversation and outlook on all the science that needs to be considered in a decision.
Right. So, in these conversations, what type of interdisciplinary relationships are we talking about? Who would be present at these types of meetings?
So it depends. I'll give you, for example, a year and a half ago, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and Coast Guard asked me to make recommendations on the use of science in the management of aquaculture.
Okay.
So in that case, of course, the deputy minister, some of the scientists in government are involved, but we put together an arm's length, actually, expert panel of experts from the various fields, economists, ocean, marine biologists, chemists, engineers, etc. And we came up with some recommendations, and also among these recommendations were putting in place an advisory committee to ensure continued actually scientific advice in the area. And I'm just so glad that actually the minister accepted the recommendations, put in place such a committee, and took into consideration a lot of the recommendations. So after that, of course, it's the department, the scientists, the policymakers who have to basically follow through.
Right. Okay. So is it often that it is a continued communication between the department and between a scientific advisor throughout a project, or is it just one instance where you would meet?
There's both. There's both depending on the issue. How sort of limited in time. So give you another example where our work was perhaps more limited in scope. So as you know, the Health Canada put out a new food guide,
Yes.
and they asked us, not to weigh in their recommendations, but well before the recommendations, to basically look into the process that they were putting in place and provide recommendations. So we did that, and then after this, they were on their own, and they did the work they needed to do.
Okay, definitely. Wow, that's very interesting. There's very interdisciplinary field that you work in. Going into the field of biomedical engineering and biotechnology, in this field, it's very important that technologies are translated into clinics and to the market so that we're able to improve Canadian healthcare. So, in what ways would the government and your role possibly be able to assist in this process?
Well, first of all, these are extremely important areas, and in fact, um, anywhere you look in terms of wanting to take on the biggest challenge of our generation, be it in terms of the health or in terms of the environment, they're all interdisciplinary, and it's something that everybody, I think, needs to wrap their head around, the government, but also the institutions, universities, granting agencies, and so on. And by the way, I was trained as a chemist, and then went on to basically do my career in molecular biology and genetics. So I'm very sensitive to the importance of interdisciplinarity. So on the one hand, I think that we need to find opportunities for everyone, from the students all the way to the researchers, to engage early on in interdisciplinary programs. So in terms of biomedical engineering or surgery or diagnostics, I mean, we have ahead of us an enormous revolution, right? With robotics, with AI, and we need to bring together the sort of the users and the technologists, those who are innovating in terms of how we can do things better, and we have to do it from very early on. So I think that we need to re-examine already at the university level how we're providing these opportunities. We need to look at our programs. Are they suited for what we need to do for the needs of the 21st century? So that's on the one hand. In terms then of the research, we need to make sure that we are supporting interdisciplinary research. And we're not siloed in terms of the health research, separate from the engineering research, separate from the population health research as well. I have to say that I'm pleased that in last year, that or this year, no, last year, I guess, we started the new programs of the New Frontier in research, and they are specifically for interdisciplinary research, and intended to bring together early career researchers, but also others, but from different areas. So this is a very important area. But then you have the entire translation part.
Yes.
And there there are some tools, but we still have to do better. So I believe that we need to look at our programs in terms of proof of principle, in terms of scaling up. When you're doing drug development, at one point you have to prepare large amount of products. This is not something that the granting council support. This is not something for now that the universities are supporting. So we still have some gaps in terms of moving the research from the university to early stages, so that proof of principle part is very important. And I think that we need to see, there's no one size fits all. It depends on the areas, of course, and how long it takes for that proof of principle. It varies greatly, but of course anything that has to do with human health is not a short term proposition.
Right.
It's long term. So we still need, I think, to do better in those areas.
Right, definitely. I think you're exactly correct with investing in the new frontiers and the interdisciplinary collaborations right from the get-go, right at ground zero. So I think that is a really good way to go. And as you were saying, it'll maybe as the projects go on and continue, maybe that last end and the translational sections might get a little bit easier. So if you could tell us a little briefly, which fields is Canada currently, do you think, investing in the next couple of years to drive either healthcare or environment? What do you think is top on the list?
Well, first of all, top on the list is to make sure that we continue to have very strong, healthy, competitive, and excellence in our, basic and applied research, if you want, because so basic research will never lead to great innovation. So I think that's something that is extremely important. It involves, of course, supporting both the talent piece, the operating cost of the research itself, but also the infrastructure of research. So there are very specialized, technologies and so on that we need to make sure they're available. I think that we can, in that sense, be proud that Canada has actually is in an enviable situation in terms of having great talent, great infrastructure, and I think that we need to keep supporting excellence for basic science. This being said, I think it's also our collective responsibility to seize the opportunity when certain fields are now mature for translation, if you want, and to make sure that the public reaps the benefit of all these investments.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned AI and robotic. I think that there are a lot of these enabling technologies.
Yes.
In which we are leaders. We are recognized among the top 5 in the world, and we need to put this to benefit the challenges that we have in terms of healthcare and in terms of the environment. So I think that a sort of focused approach on those challenges per se, and trying to find incentives to bring the various specialties that need to be brought together in those areas of health and environment, I believe are extremely important.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. So thank you very much for. We're going to wrap up our first segment, and we'll be back for our next segment in just a few minutes.
What are the non-modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease? Cardiovascular disease can be caused by a variety of risk factors we cannot control. The older you are, the more prone you are to chronic conditions like heart disease or stroke. However, men have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease earlier in life, while women are more at risk after menopause. Women may also experience different symptoms of heart attack that may go unrecognized. You may be more at risk depending on your ethnicity. People of Asian, African, or First Nation descent have higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Your ethnicity may also influence your diet, which can put you at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. If you have a first-degree relative who has had cardiovascular disease or a stroke before the age of 55 for men and 65 for women, your risk of heart disease doubles, and regular screenings with your doctor are recommended. But there is good news. Up to 80% of premature cardiovascular disease can be avoided and more effectively managed by taking these proactive steps. Quit smoking, be physically active, eat well, achieve a healthy weight, manage your stress and any anxiety or depression, and see your doctor about managing your cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood sugar levels. For more information on cardiovascular disease, please visit our website.
BEaTS Radio, scientists interviewing scientists. Canada is a worldwide leader in science and innovation. However, our communities need to be more connected to current scientific research in order to drive the future of scientific innovation. So what steps can we take to more actively engage and connect our community with scientists and vice versa? Innovation and discovery are at the core of the current efforts of our government, but science sometimes gets slightly complicated to understand. At BEaTS Radio, we will tackle this by having young scientists and early career researchers interviewing scientists and innovators. By dissecting science in simple terms, this will allow our community to better understand the importance of science for our country.
Hello and welcome back to BEaTS Research Radio, a podcast streamed live from an active lab at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. If you missed our first segment, sitting with me today is Dr. Mona Nemer. Dr. Nemer is a Chief Science Advisor to Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and Cabinet. Here today, she's talking to us a little bit about her transition from gene discovery, where she was working as a professor and as the Vice President of Research at the University of Ottawa, now to working with the Government of Canada in science policy. So to jump back into our interview, could you tell us a little bit about your goals and looking ahead for your new term as Chief Science Advisor?
Well, I'm still in my first term,
Okay.
just to be clear, so we'll see what happens after.
Right.
But for the coming year, perhaps one of our area of focus is going to be open science. So one of my key mandate is actually to ensure that science is available to the public, and think that in terms of open access and open data, that's something that's very important. And there is an international movement in that direction, and Canada really needs to be part of it. So that's going to be very a key area of focus. We're gonna continue our work in terms of more specific areas and threats in terms of environmental resilience. We hope to do something to mitigate wildfires and floods for the spring, but there's not going to be, I think, any shortage of areas to look into.
Work on. Yes, and on the topic of open access, that's something that's becoming increasingly important, and especially on topic. We had another interview on predatory journals, and kind of being able for the community to kind of be able to flag those and have that be public information. Would you have any tips for the public on ways to access types of journals and scientific information through the government websites?
Well, I mean, precisely that's why we want to make sure that the science that's funded by the public is actually accessible back to the public.
Right.
So right now, a lot of publications are behind firewalls, so you need to have subscription, otherwise you can't access them. So I think this is creating actually a lot of hardship on small institutions. It's preventing even public servants from doing their work if they can't access the results of science and research that was funded by the public. So I think that this is a top priority. It's we're gonna see how it can be done. There are platforms, there are ways of making sure that even if you're publishing in a journal that requires subscription, that some of the articles are actually openly accessible. So these are the kind of options that need to be looked into. Right now, the government of Canada has a website for science.
Okay.
It tells you some of the science that is happening in the various departments of government, the name of some scientists and experts, and the various ministries also have actually some interesting websites. Sometimes they're a little bit difficult to find, but when you find them, there is some very interesting information on them.
Okay, so in the next couple of years, also looking into open access, what fields in particular do you think Canada is going to be investing in the next 3 years, and why these in particular? I know we talked about AI in our last segment and also environmental, but why particularly some of these fields?
Well, first of all, we've heard so far that we've seen the platform of the government when they were in election, and that also of the other parties. And I think that several of them had focus on health and focus as well on the environment and clean technologies. And the Minister of Finance has already said that the next budget for Canada, which would be the 2020-2021 budget, is going to be a climate change budget. So if you think in terms what that means, it means a certain focus on clean technologies as well, to see how we can move towards net zero emissions. But also the environmental and climate change impact on health are increasingly recognized, and recognized as actually for their hardship, for their socioeconomic burden, and so on. So I think that we can, you know, expect and certainly, should be looking at ways to mitigate the impact on human health. I think we all realize that our society is aging. We all want to age. We want to age in good health, but aging is also creating a burden on the healthcare system, and we need to see how these new technologies can actually, help in terms of lowering the cost, but also improving access and improving the care.
Right. So, in what particular ways would Canada be investing in these? Are there maybe some examples for maybe specifically for healthcare?
Well, first of all, I just want to make clear that I'm not the one weighing in on where we invest and how we invest it, but like in a broad sense, of course, healthcare is a shared provincial federal jurisdiction. So I think it's really a great area of collaboration at the level of both research and improving delivery and care in many ways. So there are numerous areas, right, from how we can use AI, robotics, and diagnostics, to also how we can basically improve the flow
Yes.
of how we basically provide care.
Right.
Emergency room continue to be, an issue in most
Yes,
provinces.
that's a good example.
And I think that there's no reason why we can't be using these new technologies to actually improve the triage, improve the flow of the movement, of individuals from one area, of the emergency room to specialized care to,
Yes.
hopefully home care, because most people want to stay home, and receive care. And this is again where I think some of these new technologies can really support the will of the people to receive care in their own homes.
Definitely. So do you think, more on the topic of diversity in science and diversity in Canada, do you think Canada is doing enough currently to promote diversity in science fields?
Well, this is a topic that's very dear to my heart.
Yeah.
And I think that diversity in science is extremely important. It's important for science. It's important for society, because why would we leave a large portion of our population on the side of some of the most important socioeconomic developments, right, of the times. So if we look in terms of the participation of women in science and engineering, I think that it's an area where Canada has paid a lot of attention to in the past, I would say, few years.
Yes.
It's been a problem and a challenge since I was doing my PhD in chemistry. Things have improved. The pace, though, of improvement is insufficient. And there was a paper that was published, I believe, in Nature or Science, I'm not certain, that showed that actually if the pace of change continues like this, in certain areas like engineering, we need 100 years before we have parity, 50% female in engineering. That, of course, is totally unacceptable. So I think in terms of the sensitivity, it's there. In terms of the support also for and the encouragement to institutions to embrace diversity, the government has put in place this program called Dimension, which aims actually to support universities as they improve at all levels, from the students to the staff to the professors, the representation not only of women but underrepresented groups as well. By the way, Canada is one of only 3 countries that has such a program, so that actually measures what's happening. So it measures our progress, and actually we have, once we have data, then we know how well we're doing. Up to very recently, we didn't even have the data, and we not being only in Canada, but in most countries around the world. So this is an area where there needs to be continued attention, but it's an area where I can tell you, we're cited as an example. I've traveled to different countries, developed countries, G7 countries, and they're looking actually, with awe in many cases at what Canada has done. So it's no reason to, just tap ourselves on the shoulder and do nothing, because it has to be an ongoing
continuous improvement. Yeah. So one of my questions was to ask about where Canada is on the global scale in terms of supporting any minority groups and also women in STEM. You said we were one of the top 3.
We're one of the, we're really one of the top 3 in terms of having a program that measures our progress. The other 2 countries being the UK and the United States. That, by no means, as I said, means that we've achieved our objectives, because this was just started. I think the issue in diversity, and specifically in women in science and engineering, needs to be also tackled in with all its facets. So it's not a homogeneous, group.
Definitely.
Women in STEM, it's very different in biology than in engineering, than in physics. And people wrongly assume that it's a question of encouraging interest in the field, and that's certainly a very important area. But I don't think that women necessarily don't have an interest in scientific fields, and certainly not in engineering. Sometimes it's how we're branding, the field of study, how we're explaining or not what options in terms of career you can have once once you've studied in those programs. And there is the reality also of the milieu itself, that needs to, I think, do some introspection, and ask whether it is a supportive environment, for women and underrepresented groups. And in some cases, we have a lot of work that needs to be done there to change the culture, of those environments.
Right. So currently, do you think that a lot of, I guess, most progress has been done at the front end, where we're trying to get the women and underrepresented groups into the university programs or into these specific groups? Or do you think maybe we need more work once the program is finished, that they stay in this field and continue with their work? Because I think that seems to be an issue in terms of staying in science and engineering once the schooling is finished.
Well, absolutely. So this is why I said we have in places a problem of recruitment. In other places, we have a problem of retention, and the retention applies, throughout the career path. So if you look now at the available data, it shows that the percentage of women in science actually, slowly decreases as you go from undergraduate to graduate to postdoc, and then to leadership positions, whether we're talking about universities, government, private sector, etc. So yes, we need to increase the pool, but we also need to pay attention to every stage, and ask, why is it that women would not want, to stay and move on to the next stage. So there isn't a issue of, I think, one action. There are multiple actions that need to be taken. I believe very strongly in the importance of role models, because you can't be what you can't see, right? I think it's really important. Mentorship is critical, but like I said, this is a problem not only of a department or an institution. It's a societal problem, and it needs to be tackled.
Right. So along those lines of investing in opportunities for women and minority groups, would you say that Canada is also investing in, or hoping to invest in, early career researchers and those who are just beginning in their fields in academia?
Yeah, so early career researchers, is a very important area. As we said earlier, over the coming years, we're going to need to have more scientists and engineers, not less. So we absolutely need to have a new generation that's there. We need to provide the appropriate, conditions for them to start their career. And let's remember that we're most creative and original early on in our career. So that's a very important stage. I think that Canada, is right now one of the best countries to start your career, and I'm really very happy that several of the programs, the new programs, have a focus on early career researchers and so on. But the last thing we need is to have a focus on the early career, but not on the mid-career and later on, because then what's the point of training the best, having them start their career in a brilliant manner, and then they basically become the target for takeover from other countries and other institutions. So much like we want to have startups, grow them, and have multinational.
Yeah.
I think it's exactly the same with researchers. We want to have all of the above. So we want to recruit them, we want to support them early on, but we also want to retain them and help them scale up their research as well.
Right, definitely following every step of the way.
That's right. Yeah.
So what does Canada look like in the next 10 years from your perspective in terms of science?
Well, without putting any, pink glasses on,
Yeah.
I really see a very bright future, for science in Canada in the coming years. We have the right, ingredients, if you want, for the recipe of excellence. We have bright young people who are excited, who are enthused about science. I think that there is a broad recognition, both from the public and from the decision makers. I believe that most parliamentarians have a keen appreciation of science and its importance. So I think that we just need to make sure that we don't lose any talent, and that we support the continued innovation and excellence of our people. But it's by no means time to rest again on your laurels and saying that, hey, we're one of the best and therefore we don't have anything left to do. On the contrary, now is the time to double on our efforts and show how we support science, we support researchers for the well-being of the future of the country.
Right, definitely. Well, it's a very motivating final comment, and thank you very much for joining us on BEaTS Research Radio. If you missed our first segment, you can find that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Before we go, I'd like to thank the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, eLife, the Canadian Biomaterials Society Ottawa Student Chapter, the BEaTS Research Lab, and the Department of BMI with the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa, who are all supporting us here at BEaTS Research Radio. Thank you very much.
BEaTS Radio, scientists interviewing scientists. Canada is a worldwide leader in science and innovation. However, our communities need to be more connected to current scientific research in order to drive the future of scientific innovation. So what steps can we take to more actively engage and connect our community with scientists and vice versa? Innovation and discovery are at the core of the current efforts of our government, but science sometimes gets slightly complicated to understand. At BEaTS Radio, we will tackle this by having young scientists and early career researchers interviewing scientists and innovators. By dissecting science in simple terms, this will allow our community to better understand the importance of science for our country.